afternoon, then, folks. This is the point where I should make a joke about everybody falling asleep after lunch, but it might be the first one where actually the presenter falls asleep as well as the audience after 3 courses and a glass of wine. I'm going to try and not replicate what's been said. There's a couple of things I'll take perhaps a slightly different tack on, but hopefully some of this will be a summary of the way government in the UK and the police in the UK have approached hate crime. But not exclusive. There isn't a clear policy that says on day one, which for us would probably be 1999 when things changed dramatically for us in the UK, that somebody suddenly had a coherent policy which has led to everything happening. And the fact is it hasn't. So some of these things will be my perception of the UK government stance rather than necessarily current government policy. So I'd like you to just bear that in mind. But I'll try and explain when things are clear in terms of how the government's approach is. So, as is traditional, and as was this morning, the first question is, what is a hate crime? And when we try to do this to police leaders, it sounds a very simplistic question, and lots of them would be quite insulted by the premise. But when we did go through the process of working out what we meant by hate crime in the UK, everybody knew what they meant, but actually everybody knew something different. And when we lined even police chiefs up, they would have different interpretations of what should be a hate crime and what shouldn't. And some of it is about the criminological concept which we've talked about earlier, but some of it is about a couple of areas of confusion which I'll talk about when we get to them, that stem from the implications of a public inquiry in '99. So Nathan's already talked about that, so I won't necessarily dwell on it. Other than to say it's that broader thing. It means lots of things to lots of people. It does mean racist crime, but it would also encapsulate football violence, it would also encapsulate gang-related violence and many other things. So what also underpins it, and again trying not to replicate what you're going to hear about later, is the issue about hate. And I guess that if we was to start from scratch, we wouldn't use the term hate crime to define what we mean, because actually it doesn't necessarily help us. But we're so far entrenched in it historically and across the world, people understand what we talk about, and members of the public understand the concept of what we're talking about. What I wouldn't propose is we try to change the word we use. What I think is absolutely vital is that those of us involved in policy and delivery of hate crime policy understand what we mean when we talk about hate crime. The UK, and I think this is quite important, takes what I would call a human rights approach to hate crime policy. That this is, contrary to what some of our detractors would say, a universally applicable right to be protected from bigoted abuse. So that some of those on the right with a nationalist leaning in the UK will say that this is about pandering to minority communities. It's about governments winning over the hearts and minds of minority communities. And it does it in a way that's politically correct, that's not well intended, and that actually gives a lesser protection in the law to the white majority, which is the white heterosexual majority, which is usually the argument. I would argue that that is fundamentally wrong. It is not right in legislation, and it's not right in policy. That a white heterosexual male stands the same right to be protected from the law as somebody who's from a minority. So groups of gay men walking around parks beating people up for being straight would be a sexual orientation hate crime in the UK. So for that reason, I think it's really important to see this as about fundamental human rights that we all share and not preferential treatment. And we in the UK, and I'll come back to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, but Stephen Lawrence was a young lad who was murdered in London in 1993, and his murder wasn't high profile. What became high profile is the calling from his family and from friends and from advocates for an inquiry into the way that the police prosecuted and the CPS with a different role, but the way the whole of the state responded to what was a racist crime. And what we were all, the inquiry happened and reported in 1999, and there was quite significant, real and genuine criticism that the government and the police chiefs and the prosecutors and that everybody else accepted were failings in the criminal justice system to that point. But it brought out some really key principles that are perhaps peculiar to the UK in our response. So I just thought I'd dwell on a couple of them because they are really quite important to us and have already been alluded to today. One is about the importance of perception, and this is hugely controversial. That academics will argue, that detractors will argue, that some liberalist-minded people, some people where freedom of speech is important, will argue that actually what we're doing is giving the right for for victims to choose their level of service, and we would fundamentally disagree with that. The victim can't perceive that a crime is a crime. We have Home Office counting rules and we have legislation which is got to be adhered to. But actually what the Stephen Lawrence inquiry held, and I think you'll see international examples of it, is where the police were denying access to the recognition of the problem because the police officer wasn't convinced by the motive of the offender. And the Stephen Lawrence inquiry found, and government accepted, that actually the damage is caused if the person perceives that to be the case. And they talked about secondary victimisation, where the denial of the acceptance of a hate crime and the denial of a service that recognises that actually secondary victimises a person who's already traumatised by it. So that perception is key. Also the importance of non-crime incidents, and Nathan mentioned this earlier on, that this was an area of significant confusion within the police in particular. What we have is a situation which is even more controversial than perception-based recording, because what those, particularly on the right wing of Christian groups, will say is that we've actually turned from being the crime police to being the thought police, and we're no longer interested in what people do, but we're interested in what they think. The argument that came through, that was accepted by government out of the inquiry and has been accepted ever since and has never been challenged to a point where government has changed its mind, is that actually non-crime incidents are important. They're important because we have this view, without necessarily massive empirical evidence to back it up, but we have a view that we accept that people don't commit a murder as the first offence. That where somebody goes on to commit a hate-filled murder, you can inevitably find an escalation of behaviour, an escalation of hostility, or even an escalation of victimisation to the victim prior to the offence. So what we have to do is to recognise that the best way of preventing crimes happening is to deal with the minor offences, to deal with the bigotry that's exposed during education and to educate against that, to deal with the low-level antisocial behaviour which is bigoted in its nature, and deal with that before people go on to set off nail bombs in the streets of London. So that's really important. It has been badly executed. Police officers have allowed us to be criticised by what I think the phrase ham-fisted approach, that we've been used a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and often we've been criticised, quite often we've been criticised wrongly, and that actually people have used false information to show that the police have overreacted. But there is a real balance there that the police have to find of acting within the law, but acting as almost assisting in community cohesion rather than enforcing legislation. So there was two areas of confusion when we looked at it in 2007. The two areas of confusion was that link between incidents and crimes, and also about what strands we would include. And we took a view back in 2007 that it was absolutely wrong, and you'll hear from Sylvia later the best example possible of why it's absolutely wrong, to deny that a crime which doesn't fit into one of those strands that we've tried to record earlier on from the different states, that a crime that has the same motivation, has the same hostility, but just a different subject, is any less of a hate crime, that it's any less damaging to victims or to the broader community, or any less damaging to society. So what we did is we felt that we needed to draw a line around where policy sat and where we measured data and where we measured crime. And we came up with the definition is that Nathan showed you earlier on, which is accepted across the criminal justice system, but isn't the definition of hate crime, it's the definition of monitored hate crime. And that's really important because it's not to deny the existence of other types of hate crime. But we measure those as we see, and they are disability, race, religion, sexual orientation and transgender, and they're all inclusive. So sexual orientation includes heterosexual, race includes the majority as well as minority race. So why is it important? And I'll skirt over this because a lot of it has been covered. Paul's evidence is the most comprehensive I've seen in terms of why it has a greater impact on the victim. It's different for different people, but for me, the one thing that wasn't mentioned this morning that I think is really relevant is about the fear of it happening again. If I walk out of here and somebody takes offence as I'm walking towards the railway station in Strasbourg and doesn't like me, or I upset them, or I stand in the way and they assault me, I'm going to get on a train and I'm no more at risk of being attacked when I get to the other end of the train than now. If I'm attacked because I'm gay, or if I'm attacked because I'm from a minority ethnic group, I'll still be gay and I'll still be from that minority ethnic group when I go off at the other end. And what I know in my heart is that this isn't an individual hostility, it's a hostility that exists in communities. So actually a hate crime is a signal that I'm not welcome in society. And I know that's much broader, so I know that that's one of the factors why I think it would have a greater detrimental effect. And when we talk about people who will struggle to rationalise the crime and rationalise the impact of the criminality, it's no more so than a subject that I'm sure Nadine is going to cover, which is about people with learning disability or mental ill health, where they don't necessarily have the same ability to rationalise what's happened and why something's happened. And one of our advisory group talks about an absent presence, and what she means by that is long after the offender's gone, the damage is still being caused, and often the offender will have forgot all about the victim, but the victim will still be suffering the impact of a crime many years later. And when I do talks like Nadine will talk about, doing talks to lots of community groups, I will get people walk up to me and say, you talked about Brett Martin, and something similar, obviously not so severe, but something similar happened to me. And you were immediately looking for an operational police officer to come and talk to them to say, right, you need to tell this police officer. And when you ask them when it happened when they're 18 and they're in the mid-50s, and still the implications of what's happened is still damaging them 30 years on. So it is that more important. We know that it affects the wider community. We know that gay people will suffer from homosexual targeted hate crime, regardless of whether they know the victim, whether they know the offender, because they know the hostility and they know the fear and they know the risk. So we know that it affects the wider community. It has a massive impact on community cohesion. That community cohesion in the UK is something that we talk a lot about. We have legal duties to consider and to promote good relationships between minority communities as part of our equality legislation. But actually the greatest symbol of that, of those cohesion breaking down, is hate crime. We know it affects the confidence in the police and others. My son's a young police officer in Manchester who will still get called a racist by members of the public, and their evidence that he's a racist will be that the Stephen Lawrence inquiry proved that he was racist and the police were racist. And my son was 7 when Stephen Lawrence was murdered, but it's still damaging the confidence on his ability to go into court and give evidence, or his ability to go into the community and be seen as impartial, because of the finding that the police were institutionally racist, which perhaps isn't the same meaning, but nonetheless it impacts. We've talked about preventing the escalation of seriousness, and it is a government priority. Our coalition government has it within its manifesto to reduce or to increase the recording of hate crime, which it believes is underreported. But most importantly, because the bigotry continues, and here's a picture of are you going to talk about Fiona Pilkington? Okay. Here's a picture of Fiona Pilkington on the right, and Frankie Hardwick, a daughter, on the left. Both suffered from learning disability. Frankie suffered quite dramatically, but also suffered quite dramatically from abuse by youths in the neighbourhood where they lived. And what happened is that they made 33 calls to the police and to other agencies for support, and each individual incident wasn't high profile. And we go back to that minor crimes having a major impact. And each crime wasn't necessarily in its own right majorly significant in the grand scale of things. But actually, the culminative effort and the fact that the police and the other agencies were dealing with them as individual crimes over a 10-year period meant that it built to a situation where Fiona Pilkington took a view that the best thing that she could do for her daughter to protect her from what her life experience was to take her life. So she went into a car, parked in a lay-by, and set fire to a car with them both in, and both died. And most of us couldn't imagine any situation in our lives where we thought that taking the lives of somebody we care about is the best option for them. And I can't conceivably think of the circumstances that could be the case. But that was the case for her, and it was very real. But actually, when you look at the crimes that she suffered, every one was minor. It was the culminative effort of that being targeted by the community, and the sense of isolation, and the sense of the fact that nobody was there to help. Okay. I'll really briefly skirt through this. The legislative tools in the UK came around piecemeal. They don't stem from one policy. They stem from different incidents, and Parliament took different views on the policies as it talked about. And this really would take what Bethan's going to talk about, I guess. But we have incitement to hatred offences, which are very different, and I'll leave them to one side. We have racial and religiously motivated offences, which were created as possibly a knee-jerk reaction to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, but have created an unintended hierarchy that people from disabled communities, that people from LGBT communities will argue that there's a hierarchy of importance for victims because the UK has got specific offences. So whilst they are limited in that they only cover 4 different offence types, they cover criminal damage, minor assaults, minor public order, and harassment, I didn't say it. So they're limited in that respect, but they also create this unintended hierarchy. What we have, which is sort of significantly more impactful, is what we've already heard about, is about the enhanced sentencing legislation that we have. Again, I won't steal Sylvia's thunder, but there are arguments that it should be extended. It covers 4 of those 5 strands. It doesn't cover transgender at the moment. Government has recently had a green paper which has taken consultation from many members of the public about whether this should be a generic offence that covers all hate crime, whether it should have other groups attached to it. But for now, it is there. What I would say, that contrary to what we heard about when we were summarising different EU states, it's not optional for courts. If a court is satisfied that a crime was motivated, then it has to enhance the sentence, and it has to declare so. And G. Walker, who's the mother of Anthony Walker, who I'll just briefly come on to now, will say that it was the most significant indicator to her that the state didn't tolerate racist crime, was the declaration in court of the enhancing of the sentence. So, very, very briefly, Stephen Lawrence was the most significant, probably the most significant incident in policing in my 26-year career, but certainly the most important in terms of the way we police hate crime and the way we police minority communities. There was lots of failings identified during the inquiry, and it was in 1999, when it came to the public awareness, the most significant issue. And I'm just going to go through a couple of cases which are probably illustrative rather than necessarily impactive, but they show the importance of different things. This is a picture of Johnny Delaney, who was murdered in 2003 in Almsmere Port in Cheshire. And he was a young traveller lad, a gypsy traveller, Roma, similar community to Roma in lots of Europe, and similar hostility towards the community exists in lots of Europe. And he was murdered in a park, and one of the offenders said there he deserved it, he's only a fucking gyppo. Now, that was prosecuted as a racist crime by the police. It was prosecuted by the CPS as a racist crime, but when it got to court, it wasn't enhanced sentence as a racist crime. The judge made it clear that the trial would proceed not as a racist crime. And I make no judgment about that whatsoever, because I know nothing of the detail of the case as to why he made that judgment. But it is impossible, and this is for me the importance of it, it's impossible to go to any gypsy traveller community in the country now and talk about hate crime without them referring to the murder of Johnny Delaney, and without them referring to their perception that the state doesn't protect them in the way that it does other minority groups, because the evidence for it is that the case that was clearly, in their view, racist crime wasn't prosecuted as such. Anthony Walker was murdered in 2005, similar time to Jody Dabrowski, who was a young gay man who was murdered in London. And the reason I think these are really significant is because the families of both will say that the criminal justice system helped them deal with the tragedies that they face. The murders were similar, the tragedies were similar, the public outcries were similar. But actually, what G. Walker will say and what Jody Dabrowski's mum will say is that the criminal justice system helped them deal with it, helped them to deal with the tragedy and get over the tragedy. whereas Doreen Lawrence and Neville Lawrence, who are Stephen's parents, will say that the criminal justice system helped them, hindered them, and actually exacerbated the tragedy. And whilst I wouldn't be as naive to say that we got it wrong in every occasion in 1993, or that we get it right on every occasion in 2005, but it's an indicator of how the criminal justice system progressed and how the importance of getting it right on the communities. And then Brett Martin, which was illustrative of one of a series of high-profile deaths of disabled people who were attacked, and he was killed in 2007, and came to trial, and a group of youths had befriended him, and I know you're going to talk about this sort of behaviour, but it brought forward a problem that we hadn't experienced or hadn't become cognizant of in the UK as criminal justice agencies, and is undoubtedly our greatest challenge in responding to hate crime in the UK, the issue of disability hate crime, which you're going to talk about again. But it was massively, massively underreported. If we think that the British Crime Survey would indicate that we record about 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 hate crimes, and Stonewall's Gay British Crime Survey gave the same sort of data, the potential for a hate crime against a disabled person to be reported and recorded as such is very small. So actually, it is undoubtedly our greatest challenge that we face as government and as agencies. And then finally, I obviously Sylvia will talk about the tragedy of her daughter's murder later, but it's really important, illustrative to us in terms of policy, because when the judge sentenced the offenders for Sophie's murder, he made it clear that this was a hate crime. He made it clear that the hostility was that of a hate crime. And he made it clear that the impact was, and we know that the impact on the family, on friends, on people who identify in the same lifestyle as Sophie did, and the broader communities are as affected by this as minority ethnic groups in terms of race crime, or LGBT groups in terms of homophobic crime. And what we felt is that whilst we've drawn up a definition of monitored hate crime which doesn't include alternative lifestyles, it is absolutely essential that we learn the lessons, and that most importantly we apply them to the way we deal with bigotry and hostility in communities, and the way we deal with the criminal justice response to such crimes. Okay. You've had this data, but I left it in because it's my favourite slide. This is the OSCE region that Nathan talked about. This is our 52,102 crimes, and you'll see there that the two darker shaded countries, the South and Germany, are darker shaded because in 2008 we were the only two countries that would record disability within its hate crime, or could give data for such. Since then, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Act in the USA has actually brought the USA much closer aligned to us in terms of data. But where we talked about, somebody mentioned this morning about the USA having hate crime legislation, whilst it has, it's not necessarily about the crimes. The hate crime legislation is about voluntary recording of hate crime. And where Nathan talked about the disparity between ourselves and between the US, actually policy isn't overly dissimilar, but it's about having 17,700 law enforcement agencies and your ability to centrally collate that data. Okay. So in terms of looking around, Russian Federation had 460, and for those of us who receive emails about the racist situation in Moscow, lots of people would think there was that many murders in Moscow, looking at the data that we tend to get out. But the Russian Federation, and it comes back to that point earlier about how you record data, will record a hate crime when a court assesses it to be so. So actually, for a crime to be a hate crime in the Russian data, we have to have had the crime, recognised it as being a hate crime, caught the offender, prosecuted the offender, convicted the offender, and then the judge say that it was. So actually you can understand why you can't compare those sets of data. And then there's European comparison. Italy's really important for me because the demographics being similar to the UK, but also because of the anti-Roma hostility that occurred in 2008 in and around Naples and other places. So, within the UK, of our 52,100, You can see the split there in terms of the data. The vast majority are race hate crimes. Disability went up in 2009 from 800 in the first year we started to gather data in 2008. Transgender went up from 200 to 312. But these two in particular are massively, massively underreported. Whilst a 75% increase is positive, we still know it's the tip of the iceberg. The prosecutions looks really healthy when you look at, and this is not criticism of the CPS, but of the criminal justice system. Actually, when you look at a third of cases being prosecuted, you think that's fairly healthy, but actually when you scratch below the surface, it's not. When we looked at criminal justice responses, we found that on average, where we looked, they got a 37% detection rate. Sorry, they got a 36% detection rate. But when we asked the questions of the victims, did you know the offender? 37% of them knew the name of the offender. So actually the amount of crimes we detect through traditional investigation is actually very slight. And the reason it's so healthy is because lots of the offences are public order offences which wouldn't be recorded unless we had an offender that was arrested at the time. So I'm just going to go through some of our current challenges and then I'll leave it at that, because the way we deal with hate crime affects other policy, and the way we deal with other policy affects hate crime, because we're talking about groups who have similar experiences. One of the challenges is the challenge of the new right, that there are new tactics brought around where the right wing in the UK, the nationalists in the UK, have suddenly taken on a view which is not against race, not against even religion, but is against extremist religion. And what we have is racists manifesting themselves as single issue groups purporting to be wanting to root the UK of radical Islam in their instance. And it's a very different tactic. There is a blurring of boundaries. There's a rise in neo-Nazism across Europe, but there's also a new feel to that in the way that people are thinking more about what they say before they say it, and are sitting close to the line of reasonableness, or past the line of reasonableness maybe, but close to the line of legality. We've got a link with preventing violent extremism that the picture which I shot off was of the London bombings in July 2005, which was undoubtedly a hate crime. It was undoubtedly a crime targeted against people because of their ethnicity, because of their religion, because of they weren't of one given religion. But the blurring of that in terms of policy creates real challenges to us, because that we see policy in terms of extremism or policy in terms of terrorism as a single box, when actually hate crime fits right away across from the antisocial behaviour policy right the way through to terrorism. We have issues about that are in and around the same groups, in and around the same structures, and the same communication and confidence that we build in the way we deal with hate crime will enable us to better deal with these sorts of crimes. So issues like forced marriage, FGM, child sexual exploitation, people trafficking, we're relying on a confidence between victims groups and the criminal justice system, and the ability and the communication links to be able to share information. And if we're not dealing with one right, the chances of us dealing with the other are seriously hindered. And then the issue of new communities is really important. There's two pictures here which I would ordinarily try not to talk about other states when talking about ours. But there's two pictures there. One is of a burning Roma site in and around Naples in 2008, where the community turned on based on political speeches, based on all sorts of misconceptions, based on a breakdown of community cohesion, and turned on a community and set fire to communities, and lots of people were hurt, lots of animosity caused and lots of crime caused in the name of hostility. And this for me is far more damning. This is a picture of two young children who were Roma children who were begging on a beach in that area. And whilst they're begging, they went swimming in the sea and they drowned. And what really I find quite tragic is a situation where somebody has taken the children's bodies out of the sea and put them on the beach, and then covered them up and left the scene to wait for undertakers, I presume. And what we've got is a situation where the disdain to them as two young children from a community that's ostracised, that's hostile, that's been victimised and identified as the root cause of all the problems, that the disdain allows people to sit there and sunbathe while two dead children sit next to them on a beach. And I find that tension and that hostility and that sense of isolation deeply worrying, particularly given that this is not the middle of the last century, but 2 or 3 years ago. Okay, I'm going to skip through this and just go to my one. I've got one more subject which I just particularly wanted to raise, which, sorry, 2 secs. Recognise I'm over my 20 minutes now. I just want to raise this issue of the internet, because it hasn't particularly been mentioned at any length. But I think it's probably our greatest challenge. And when we look at what the EU can do, or what the OSCE can do, or what international agencies can do, the internet is perhaps the greatest area of potential, because I think it's massively significant. There are some significant challenges. The emergence of Web 2.0 meant that something which was posted one way is now interactive. And what the communities in the UK will tell us is that whereas before they could find, for instance, anti-Semitic material, if they went and looked for it and went into the right blog rooms and found it, they could find it. But actually what Web 2.0 did meant that people were cutting and pasting it and were putting it on mainstream newspapers. They were putting it on the comments page of stories in everyday newspapers. So the emergence of Web 2.0 had a significant effect because it brought that exposure of hostility to the masses rather than to the few. It creates a new offending behaviour. It is far more easy to be vociferous if you're anonymous, and people, it's very difficult when you look at material to see whether it's a hardened terrorist or whether it's a 14-year-old who hasn't really thought through, who's just typing something on and giving themselves some super name. And also it takes them out of their social norms. They don't have to interact with somebody to hate them or to demonstrate that hate. So it changes that behaviour. It changes the behaviour that we would have expected to see, where people write on notebooks in their own bedroom how they hate a group of people, to suddenly being able to put it on the internet and share it with everybody. It takes away the issue of editorial control. If we wanted to get a letter into a national newspaper 10 years ago, we'd have had to get an editor to accept it was a reasonable letter to put in. Now we can just post it up and it's there immediately for everybody to see. One of the real challenges is about international disparity, and probably to polarise it, you've got the UK approach in terms of incitement that you're going to hear about on one end, and the US approach, which I guess Bethan is also going to talk about, of the First Amendment on the other. And actually the disparity makes policy and actually practice really difficult. And we know that there is lots of stuff out there that we don't have reported to us. And actually when we lift the stone, we know it's going to be really unpleasant. We've got international cooperation or international apathy, and I suspect we're far nearer to apathy than we are cooperation. We've got a huge issue of geographical jurisdiction, and you're going to talk about Shepherd and Whittle. Okay, well, Shepherd and Whittle, which you'll hear about, for us made it slightly easier in the UK, but you've still got that issue about international jurisdiction that we need to grapple with. I understand that with the internet, we're not good at dealing with fraud on the internet, we're not good at dealing with identity fraud, we're not good at dealing with anything on the internet, but we're certainly not good at this. We know that there's either ignorance, apathy, or inability within the industry. That people who are now the CEO of a multinational organisation worth billions, 10 years ago was a 19-year-old sitting in his bedroom with a good idea. And actually the ability and the social conscience that you would expect in a traditional organisation that's been building over centuries isn't there when somebody just inherits a good idea and inherits a huge corporation. We know that there's opportunities as well as threats. This is our online reporting mechanism that if you're looking at research, if you're looking at the information about the UK police approach, this is a really good site. If you look at True Vision, it's where we put all of our data, all of our policy, all of our reports, all of our news, but also allows people to report crime online so that they can use that same anonymity if they wish to, that the offenders use. So it's called True Vision, and you can find it on a Google search. We know that there's gaps in our academic understanding. I'll leave you with these 2 points, because I think there are real gaps in terms of, and I'll just give two by way of example, perhaps the most significant two, about the internet. The link between exposure to hate material and physical offending. We know that criminologists have told us that people who live in streets with broken windows are more likely to go out and commit minor crime. they're more likely to justify it to themselves as normal behaviour because everybody's doing it. And if I'm exposed to material which tells me that the Roma are the root of all evil in Europe and that the reason there's the social problems exist are because of the Roma, I'm far more likely to justify it to myself going out and committing crime based on that. So what I would really like to see is some really strong evidence which tells us about that link and understands the link. And then the other one is about the link between exposure to the hate material, exposure to that sort of bigotry in the community, and the impact on a community's sense of belonging, on the community's sense of worth, or the fear of crime. So for me, I'll leave you with those points, but for me, those are a couple of areas where academic research would really assist us in policy delivery. Thank you very much.
Now, I don't want to claim that we had the idea already, but we actually have a student intern starting in June to look at hate crime.
Excellent.
What they're going to find out, we'll have to wait and see.
Okay.
It's an area that interests
the only, whilst I think it's great, the only problem for us as policymakers is academic research takes years and we'll be forced out of the job by then.
We'll do our best. We'll
Yeah, thanks very much. Any questions?
What kind of research would you need?
We actually take, we had a ministerial, on those last 2 points, we had a ministerial seminar in 2009 where the community and academics came and presented to ministers their view. And their view was that when we looked at people like David Copeland, who was mentioned earlier, who set off nail bombs in London in 1999, we know that he was exposed to that sort of material. That what we don't know, I believe that if I was exposed to it day in, day out, it's not going to go and make me commit crime. But if I'm not saying I'm not a social reject, but if I'm somebody who's socially uneasy, who is the sort of person who's going to commit that sort of crime, does it make me more likely to do it? What the forensic psychologists who look at sex offenders would call the maladaptive coping strategies, the ability to rationalise and normalise behaviour. Does my exposure to that material make me do that? So that government and the criminal justice agencies accepted the testimony of the communities which said that was the case. We can't evidence that, I guess, and that was the issue. The other one is about if we're trying to measure cohesion, if we're trying to measure whether communities are, whether there's tension, does exposure to that affect? And again, the testimony was that it does. We accept it was, and we go along just basing policy on the fact that it does because we think it does, and nobody's told us any different. But it actually would be good to understand it, particularly when we're looking about solutions to remove or otherwise, I guess.
There's just following on from that point, there's an organisation called the International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation. That's primarily looking at Islamic extremism and the far right extremism, but obviously hate crime falls within that. One of the things they've done is they have a study which has taken place over like the last 10 years, and we used one of their experts in the trial recently. What he could say on paper, but we couldn't use, the courts wouldn't accept it because it wasn't, that there's nothing to counteract it, that there's no, it's not been tested in essence. But they had a scale from 1 to 10, and the particular individual that was being prosecuted, he'd been distributing terrorist publications on the internet, and looking at his behaviour, everything that he had, what he'd been doing, his background, what he had on the computer, and what his intentions were, they said he's number 7 on the scale, 10 being a suicide bomber, actually carrying something out. They said, we say he's number 7. Unfortunately, we weren't able to use that in court, but it is evidence there are people out there looking at those sort of things, but it's early days, I guess, so it wasn't relied upon.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking about what would actually be required by research that would be able to really prove something about the possible link between the exposure to hate material and actions. I mean, one way, of course, is to look at offenders, but that's only half the way, and that's the easy part of it. Because in order to prove a link, you would also have to look at general population that are exposed to this material and how many of these are engaging in these sort of actions. And then, of course, to prove the link, you have to do more. But I think that's the very hard part. It's a huge sociological project, really. On that side. I mean, it would be. I think the thing that you mentioned would be the easiest thing to start with, because then you have the population. It's easy to find them, right? It's much harder to sort of find the ones who are being regularly exposed to this sort of material in the general population if they're not in prison and you know it already or something like that. So it's a challenge.
That's why we brought it here.
Right.
On that note, my current strategy as regards timing is that we will have veterans talk